It really makes you think, doesn't it? Marshal Foch, back in 1919, looking at the Treaty of Versailles,
Yeah.
he called it a 20-year armistice, not real peace. And, well, looking back, those words seem incredibly prophetic.
Chillingly so.
So today we're doing a deep dive into a battle that really feels like a direct consequence of that uneasy peace.
Yeah.
The Battle of Stalingrad.
Absolutely. And Stalingrad, it wasn't just, another big battle. It was a genuine turning point in World War II.
Right.
To really get it, though, we need to look at the context. Think about Germany after World War I. Humiliated, economy shattered.
Yeah, and then the Great Depression hits. Black Thursday. Just
catastrophic.
Exactly. Yeah. Catastrophic. And that kind of desperation, well, it created this fertile ground for extreme ideas.
Enter Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. By 1933, they're in charge, and immediately, Germany's on a warpath.
They basically just ripped up the Treaty of Versailles, didn't they? Started rearming like crazy. Astonishing speed. And you could feel this desire for revenge in the air. Yeah. The world seemed almost, asleep to the danger.
And this next war, World War II, it was a totally different kind of conflict compared to the first.
Completely different beast.
We're talking at least 60 million deaths. Minimum. It's staggering. And the horrifying part, unlike World War I, most of the casualties, over 60%, were civilians.
60%. Just, wow. Warfare had changed fundamentally. The lines were blurred.
Horrifyingly blurred.
And Germany's initial campaigns.
Yeah.
They were just terrifyingly effective. Blitzkrieg.
Lightning War, the whole idea was speed, overwhelming force, shatter the enemy before they even know what's hit them.
And it worked. Nation after nation just collapsed.
That?
France, with its supposedly unbeatable Maginot Line.
Fell in 6 weeks.
6 weeks. It's almost unbelievable, even now.
It is. And what's really fascinating looking back is that initial, almost bizarre relationship between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yeah.
1939.
Yeah, that non-aggression treaty. It was a massive shock to everyone. They basically agreed to carve up Eastern Europe between them.
Which led directly to the joint invasion of Poland.
The idea of these two, completely opposed ideologies working together, it seemed unthinkable.
Unthinkable, but it happened. Still, like Foch predicted, those kinds of deals don't last, do they?
Not between regimes like those. Hitler, always looking east, always driven by this expansionist ideology. Eventually, he turned on the Soviets.
Operation Barbarossa, June 21st, 1941. A massive invasion.
Huge. And despite, numerous warnings, the Soviets were caught largely off guard.
It's incredible how many signs they missed or ignored. Like that story about the German communist printer.
Oh, the phrase book, yeah. He secretly got this Russian-German phrase book to the Soviet consulate.
Not just any phrase book, though.
No. It had things like surrender, hands up, don't move or I'll shoot.
Direct intelligence, basically.
Pretty much. And even that wasn't enough to fully convince Stalin the invasion was imminent. Baffling, really.
So the invasion starts. And the Germans had clear goals, right?
Oh, yeah. Leningrad in the north, St. Petersburg now. Moscow, the capital, obviously crucial. And Kiev, the heart of the agricultural region in the south.
And Leningrad. My God, that siege. 900 days.
Unimaginable suffering. For everyone involved, attackers and defenders. Just brutal.
And the Eastern Front itself, it posed unique problems for the German army, didn't it? Problems they maybe hadn't fully anticipated.
Definitely. The sheer distances involved were one thing, just vast. But then you had the roads, or lack of them.
The Rasputitsa.
Exactly. The spring and autumn mud seasons turn everything into a quagmire. Movement just ground to a halt. Tanks, trucks, everything bogged down.
A logistical nightmare.
Completely. And then, of course, the Russian winter. -20, -30 Celsius, maybe even colder.
Freezing. And their equipment wasn't really designed for that, was it?
Not at all. And the supply lines were stretched so thin already. There's that grim story about the soldiers with lice.
Oh, yeah. Being told just to tear their trousers.
Because stopping to actually deal with the lice meant freezing to death. It shows you the desperation.
And the whole approach to human life. It was just different on the Eastern Front, wasn't it? Particularly on the Soviet side.
Starkly different. Stalin's mindset was just, keep sending more men. Quantity over quality, almost. That famous quote about the Pope.
How many divisions does the Pope have? Chilling.
It really highlights that ruthless calculus. Life was expendable in a way that's hard for us to fully comprehend.
So, initially, the Germans had big successes. They captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners.
Huge numbers. And the fate of those prisoners. It was often horrific. Starvation, disease, mistreatment. Appalling conditions.
It took Smolensk, a key city on the road to Moscow.
They did. But here's the thing. Every time they seemed to win a major battle, they just found themselves facing another, even larger Soviet army further east. Maybe not as well equipped initially, but huge numbers.
And the Soviets used some, well, unconventional tactics too, like the mine dogs.
Yes, the anti-tank dogs. Trained to run under German tanks with explosives, a desperate measure, for sure.
Must have had a psychological impact too.
Undoubtedly. Unsettling, to say the least.
So the Germans push towards Moscow. They get really close, right, to the outskirts.
Agonizingly close. But they stalled.
Why? What stopped them?
A combination of things, really. That brutal winter hitting hard, the supply lines completely breaking down, and Soviet resistance stiffening, becoming more organized, more determined.
They just couldn't take the capital?
Nope. And that failure at Moscow, that's what leads to this major shift in strategy. Hitler turns his focus south.
Towards the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad, formerly Tsaritsyn.
Exactly. And Hitler had very specific reasons for this southern push.
Oil, right. The Caucasus oil fields.
Absolutely critical. Germany needed that oil desperately for its war machine. Securing the Caucasus was paramount.
And Stalingrad itself, what was the strategic value there?
Well, capturing Stalingrad would secure the flank for the push to the oil fields. Plus, it sits right on the Volga River, a vital transport artery for the Soviets. Cutting that off would cripple southern Russia.
And then there was the name.
Oh, definitely. Taking the city named after Stalin himself, that was a huge symbolic prize for Hitler. Personal animosity played a big role.
So the forces line up for this massive campaign. Who was involved on the Axis side?
It was a significant force. You had the German 6th Army, a very large infantry army under General Paulus, the 4th Panzer Army, mobile armor under Hauth, the German 2nd Army supporting, and the Italian 8th Army.
Plus allies.
Yeah, bolstered by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops as well. On paper, a very powerful force.
But the Soviets, defending the city under General Zhukov, they had a specific plan, didn't they?
They did. Zhukov developed this tactic, this defensive posture. He called it hugging the enemy.
Hugging. What did that mean in practice?
It meant keeping the Soviet defensive lines extremely close to the German forward positions, literally meters away sometimes, in the rubble.
Why? What was the advantage?
It sounds counterintuitive, but it was ingenious. By staying so close, they minimized the effectiveness of Germany's biggest advantages: air power and artillery.
Because the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb or strafe Soviet positions without risking hitting their own troops.
Exactly. Same for German artillery. It forced the battle into incredibly close quarters, fighting street by street, building by building. It negated Germany's technological edge in some ways.
Leveled the playing field, but in the most brutal way possible.
Precisely. So the actual battle for the city itself kicks off, when was it? August 23rd, 1942.
That's the date. And it started with just absolute devastation from the air.
The Luftwaffe, Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen's 4th Air Fleet, they unleashed this massive carpet bombing campaign.
Air raid sirens went off. Apparently, after months of alerts, a lot of the civilians didn't take it seriously enough.
Yeah.
And Stalin hadn't allowed an evacuation, had he?
No, he refused. So you had roughly 500,000 civilians trapped in the city, directly in the path of the bombing.
Just awful. And the bombing itself.
Unimaginable ferocity. They just systematically pulverized the city, turned it into fire and smoke. People compared it to Guernica, the bombing during the Spanish Civil War.
Picasso's painting comes to mind.
Exactly. And before a single German tank even entered the city proper, estimates suggest maybe 40,000 civilians were already dead.
40,000. Just from the bombing.
Yeah. A horrific start to what would become, well, hell on earth.
What followed was just this incredibly vicious urban warfare, wasn't it?
Some of the most brutal in history. House to house, room to room fighting, in the ruins, in the sewers. Casualties were astronomical on both sides.
And Zhukov's hugging tactic really came into its own here.
Absolutely. Every destroyed building became a fortress, every pile of rubble a potential ambush point. It was a nightmare for the attackers. The German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg.
Rat war. Fighting an enemy you often couldn't even see.
Exactly. General Strecker, one of the German commanders, wrote about the Soviet soldier being like an invisible being, appearing from nowhere in the ruins. The psychological toll must have been immense.
And the Soviets used other tactics to wear down morale, too, right? Night attacks, flares.
Constantly. Night attacks to deny the Germans rest. Constant use of flares. So there was never really true darkness, just this eerie, flickering light and the constant threat of attack.
That detail about the greetings changing. Instead of good night, it became quiet night.
Sockengesäller. Yeah, it's a small thing, but it speaks volumes about the shared experience of constant stress and exhaustion.
But we should be clear, conditions for the Soviet soldiers were also unbelievably harsh.
Oh, absolutely. You had the NKVD, the secret police, positioned behind the lines along the Volga.
With orders to shoot any retreating soldiers.
That was the order. No retreat. Stand or die. Then there were rumors, maybe German propaganda, maybe true, that deserters were just being sent home.
Which ironically led to more desertions.
It seems so in some cases. Highlighting the desperation, there's that tragic story of the Tatar soldier.
The one who deserted at night.
Yeah, and accidentally stumbled into a Soviet position thinking they were Germans. He confessed to deserting.
And basically signed his own death warrant.
Just tragic. And you saw disciplinary problems too, understandably. Alcohol abuse became an issue as soldiers tried to cope with the horror.
And the fighting for specific buildings, it became legendary. Weeks fighting over a single factory or apartment block.
Absolutely, like Pavlov's house.
Right, tell us about that.
Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a handful of men held this one strategic apartment building overlooking the river. Held it for months against constant German attacks.
Incredible resilience.
Chukov supposedly joked later that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris.
Wow. Whether it's literally true or not, it makes the point about the intensity, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The sheer ferocity of the defense.
But as this meat grinder continued through the autumn, another factor started to play a bigger role.
General Winter arrived.
The Russian winter descends again. Blizzards, deep freezes.
And it effectively halts the German offensive in its tracks. They're bogged down in the ruins, freezing, exhausted.
And just when the Germans are stuck, maybe thinking they can just hold on through the winter.
The Soviets spring their trap, Operation Uranus.
A massive counteroffensive. Tell us about the plan. It was audacious, right?
Incredibly bold.
Yeah.
They decided to attack not in Stalingrad itself, but on the flanks, northwest and south of the city, specifically targeting the sectors held by the weaker Romanian armies.
Why the Romanians?
They were generally less well-equipped and perhaps less motivated than the German troops, seen as the weaker link in the Axis line.
And the objective of Uranus?
Simple and devastating. Punch through those Romanian lines with overwhelming force, swing around behind Stalingrad, and encircle the entire German 6th Army under Paulus, plus parts of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army trapped in the city.
A huge pincer movement. A massive gamble.
Huge gamble. It required incredible secrecy and coordination.
And the Soviets managed to build up the forces for this without the Germans realizing.
Largely, yes. It was an amazing feat of logistics and deception. They amassed something like 60% of the entire Red Army's tank strength for this.
60%? How did they hide that?
Moving troops and equipment mostly at night across the Volga, disguising movements as routine defensive preparations. Poor weather helped too. We're talking over 160,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, thousands of vehicles, even horses, all moved into positions stealthily.
Incredible. So Operation Uranus launches November 19th, 7:00 a.m.
That's right. And it began with just a colossal artillery barrage. So intense, apparently, it woke up German panzer units 50 kilometers away.
Must have been terrifying, a complete shock.
For many, yes. Not just the Romanians, but even some Soviet soldiers weren't aware of the full scale of what was about to happen. Stalin had made that cryptic comment just days before.
On November 7th, the anniversary of the revolution.
Yeah, saying something like, their streets would soon see another great celebration, a hint of what was coming.
And the operation. It worked.
Spectacularly well. The Romanian lines crumbled quickly under the assault. The Soviet pincers raced forward, and by November 22nd...
Just 3 days later.
Just 3 days. The trap snapped shut. The German 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer were completely surrounded, encircled.
Wow. What was the reaction from Paulus, the German commander inside the pocket?
He immediately saw the danger. He pleaded with Hitler repeatedly for permission to attempt a breakout while they still could.
Makes sense. Try and fight their way out.
But Hitler refused. Absolutely refused. He was obsessed with holding Stalingrad. Said if they left, they'd never take it again. He declared, I know my 6th Army. They will hold out heroically.
Delusional, really, given the situation.
Completely detached from the reality on the ground. And adding to the fantasy, Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, made these wild promises.
Promises to resupply the entire army by air.
Yes, which was logistically impossible. They needed hundreds of tons of supplies, daily food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies. The Luftwaffe couldn't come close to delivering that, especially in winter conditions with Soviet fighters attacking.
So the Sixth Army was trapped, with no hope of breakout and false promises of supply. What were the conditions like inside that pocket?
Unimaginable horror, just rapidly deteriorating. Exhaustion, starvation, freezing cold, dwindling ammunition, almost no medical aid for the wounded, and constant, relentless Soviet attacks tightening the noose.
The hunters became the hunted.
Exactly. A complete reversal of roles, the constant sound of artillery day and night. Someone calculated, grimly, that a German soldier was dying inside the pocket every 7 seconds.
Every 7 seconds.
Stalingrad became this vast, frozen mass grave.
And during this time, the Soviets captured letters, didn't they? Written by German soldiers.
They did. Thousands of them. Letters home that never made it. Initially, the Soviets thought about using them for propaganda to demoralize the German home front.
But they didn't.
No. Even Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, looked at them and apparently decided they were too devastating. The raw despair, the hopelessness. It was too much even for his cynical purposes. It might backfire.
And those letters, they give us this incredibly raw insight, don't they?
A truly heartbreaking window into their final thoughts. You read about soldiers filled with dread, even those who hadn't killed anyone. This deep longing for peace, side by side with this certainty they wouldn't survive.
Mentioning frostbite, losing fingers, realizing how important small things are.
Yeah. And the disillusionment, losing faith in the Nazi ideology they'd been fed, feeling utterly sacrificed for nothing.
Just final goodbyes, knowing they'll never see family again.
Heartbreaking, the loss of faith, the fear of a meaningless death, crying out, "Ya, Anne, oh mother," or names of loved ones as they died.
Some realizing the sheer scale of the leadership's blunder, the destruction they'd caused.
One soldier writes about being in a basement, burning furniture bit by bit to stay warm, knowing it's either death or Siberia. Another writes this incredibly bitter letter to his father.
Blaming him for supporting the Nazis, for not stopping the war.
Yeah, just raw anger and despair. And then you hear about the horrific injuries, a soldier writing from Breslau about seeing a comrade who'd lost an arm and his nose. Just glimpses of the suffering.
So while this is happening inside the pocket, how is the Nazi regime presenting it back home?
Initially, they tried to downplay it. On January 16th, the official news was still talking about heroic resistance.
Denying the encirclement.
Pretty much ignoring the reality. But as it became impossible to hide, the propaganda shifted dramatically. They started portraying the Sixth Army as making this noble, willing sacrifice for Germany. Goebbels launched this huge campaign to create national mourning, but also to fuel hatred and desire for revenge against the Soviets.
Closing cinemas, censoring news.
Exactly, trying to control the narrative completely, which of course was totally at odds with the reality expressed in those captured letters or the few postcards that eventually came from POWs.
So the end comes. How did it finally play out?
Agonizingly. Hitler, in a last, almost cruel gesture, promoted Paulus to field marshal on January 30th.
Why? What was the significance of that?
No German field marshal had ever surrendered, ever. It was an implicit order. Fight to the death or commit suicide.
But Paulus didn't.
No. On January 31st, 1943, he surrendered himself and his remaining staff. Unprecedented. The news apparently stunned Hitler's inner circle, a massive blow to the myth of German invincibility.
Even after Paulus surrendered, some kept fighting.
Yeah, scattered groups held out for a few more days, maybe 10,000 soldiers fighting in the ruins, in the sewers. But organized resistance was over by early February.
And the final toll for the Germans.
Devastating. Around 100,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity from the Stalingrad pocket.
Yeah, how many came back?
Only about 5,000. 5,000 out of 100,000. They returned years later, often broken men. Were they ever the same? Probably not.
So on February 3rd, the German High Command finally announced it. How did they spin this catastrophe?
They framed it as a heroic sacrifice, naturally. Said the Sixth Army had died fighting overwhelming Soviet superiority as part of Germany's historical European mission, holding back the Bolshevik onslaught, dying for Germany's future, pure propaganda.
And Goebbels.
He immediately pivoted. All the propaganda efforts now focused on revenge, on total war, stoking hatred against the Soviets. Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, the start of the long, bloody retreat back towards Berlin.
So Stalingrad, just an immense human tragedy, unfathomable scale, and undeniably a massive strategic turning point in World War II.
Absolutely, no question. If you look for key takeaways, well, the sheer horror of modern urban warfare is one. Fighting in cities is just uniquely brutal.
And the impact of the environment. You can't ignore General Winter Or the mud.
Definitely not. And the contrasting philosophies, too. The German reliance on blitzkrieg versus the Soviet willingness to absorb massive losses and just keep fighting. The different values placed on human life, really.
And the psychological toll.
On everyone.
On everyone. The rat war, the constant fear, the triumph.
It lasted long after the guns fell silent for those who survived.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About the long shadow a defeat like that casts on a nation, on its psyche, its future. What lessons can we actually pull from those ruins, from those voices in the letters, about leadership, about resilience, about the real horrifying cost of war and ideology?
Heavy questions, and maybe ones without easy answers, even all these years later.